give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин
Mr. President, we wish at the outset to voice our disagreement in principle with the approach of the presidency with the invitation extended to today's meeting of delegations under Rules 37 and 39. A whole 7 of them are here, and they are all members of NATO and the EU. We have already repeatedly stated that the invitations to such a number of participants, the majority of whom are guided by a block-based discipline, provide no added value with rare exception. There is a negative trend where European countries, when they preside over the Security Council, they bring in the number of participants that participate in these meetings in Ukraine, and in one chorus, these participants voice talking points which are identical and voiced by the presidency of the EU. This all drags out the meeting, and the discussions during the Security Council lose any operational nature and value. We categorically object to transforming Security Council meetings into a lecture hall where a select number of countries lecture others with sermons that are completely unoriginal. We doubt that the representative of Germany today, for example, will provide a clarification about the recent statement of his foreign policy mission about Germany having a negative assessment of the Easter truce in Ukraine and the skeptical approach vis-a-vis the truce to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. Prospects for peace between Ukraine and the Russian Federation are of no concern to those in the EU. Today's meeting was requested by a number of the most stubborn European sponsors of the Kiev regime. This is a reflection of their fear of being sidelined in the context of the new U.S. administration as it seeks to arrive at a long-term solution to the Ukrainian crisis. Hence, the desire to thwart this process and to restore for Ukraine Zelensky's image of a victim, which has been tarnished in recent months in the light of the new facts that have surfaced. This apparently is designed to foster what the Ukrainian representative has on a virtually daily basis circulated, namely the correspondence with a description of Russian alleged strikes targeting civilian objects. However, this kind of a practice of whipping up emotions, in fact, does not benefit Ukraine. It plays against Ukraine time and time again with showing the blatant fakes, as was the case with the death of civilians in Kryvyi Rog and Sumak on 14 and 13 April, which became, as was incontrovertibly demonstrated, this was a consequence of the Kiev regime's egregious violation of the norms of international humanitarian law. We are deeply disappointed at the fact that the UN Secretariat, through Madame De Carlo, not only actively plays into these fakes, but quotes the premises and the talking points of the Biden administration, which the past Biden administration, thereby the Secretariat is taking the side of the party of war, grossly violating what is stipulated in Article 100 of the UN Charter, the obligation to remain impartial and objective. This approach undermines trust, not just in the statements of the Secretariat about the Ukrainian crisis, but also the allegation of its leadership about playing a constructive role towards a peaceful settlement. We further stress the fact that the Russian armed forces are carrying out strikes exclusively targeting objects that are related to the military capabilities of Ukraine. Civilian casualties occur due to the deliberate deployment of Ukrainian air defense systems in heavily populated areas and incompetent operations thereof, as well as due to the fact that Ukraine is using its own civilians as human shields. The special operation is ongoing, and the strikes on 18 April, which was the formal pretext for convening today's meeting, were carried out by high-precision weaponry targeting key production points for the launch of UAVs, as well as infrastructure for Ukraine's military airfields. All of these objectives have been achieved, and Kiev is perfectly aware of that. We, by maintaining, see such hypocritical, mendacious allegations. The Kiev clique is trying to portray this as a truth, and the European puppeteers of the Zelensky regime, in supporting this, completely unmask their true identities, and yet again they are showing their selective blindness and their blatant double standards. In London, Paris, and Brussels, and their henchmen, since August last year, they did not manage to utter a word of condemnation in the barbaric attack by the Zelensky cabal, targeting cities, towns, and villages nearing the border in Kursk Oblast. This territory was completely cleansed of the Ukrainian invaders last week. We repeatedly shared blood-curdling information and data about the atrocities perpetrated by the Ukrainian executioners, targeting the civilians in this Russian region, including murder, mass executions, rape, torture, abductions, and rampant plunder. We held an informal meeting of the Security Council with an invitation extended to witnesses of these events. The most recent was the Banderite attack on 24 April, targeting a masterpiece of ancient architecture that is the New Jerusalem Temple in Belgorod Oblast, which resulted in its destruction. This was an operating church, and there were no military targets anywhere near that area. Nevertheless, the UAS shelled this holy site, which resulted in a blaze, and subsequently they targeted the firefighters who were attempting to extinguish that blaze. From the 21st to the 27th of April alone, UAF strikes targeted and claimed 98 civilian casualties. 12 people, including a child, died. Another 86 people, including 4 minors, were wounded. Civilians were targeted with approximately 2,000 munitions, including with multiple launch rocket systems, as well as they were targeted by mines, grenades, artillery shells, including cluster munitions. Unarmed civilians were targeted by combat UAVs, as well as small arms. The lion's share of the weapons used for attacking civilians were manufactured in the West. However, Kiev's European sponsors are scrupulously avoiding any mention of the inconvenient for them topic of the Kursk misadventure, carried out by the Kiev Princeling, which resulted in the complete rout of the UAF, dealing a fatal blow to the military capabilities and morale of the Ukrainian army. There was most active participation in the liberation of Russian territory, and this was the contribution was provided by the DPRK units. At the same time, Moscow and Pyongyang are operating fully in accordance with international law, specifically Article 4 of the Agreement on the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, dating 19 June 2024, which provides for immediate delivery of military assistance in the event of an armed attack on any of the parties. We are deeply grateful to our Korean brethren whose fortitude and courage will remain forever etched in the memory of our people. Mr. President, under these circumstances, the main goal of Kiev's European accomplices has been contrary to the facts, contrary to common sense, to highlight the head of the Kiev clique's alleged aspiration towards peace, who, according to your baseless allegations, which Russia does not embrace, according to your baseless allegations, today we have heard a number of such attempts voiced by Western colleagues. London, Paris, and Brussels are finding it increasingly difficult to do this because camouflaging the increasingly striking, brutal, misanthropic and Nazi essence of the Zelensky regime is becoming increasingly difficult. The Russian Federation has been prioritizing diplomacy and peaceful scenarios for conflict resolution. We have demonstrated this time and time again. Despite Kiev's sabotage of the 30-day moratorium on reciprocal strikes targeting energy infrastructure objects, which the UAF violated more than 130 times, the Russian Federation undertook an act of goodwill, announcing an Easter truce from 1800 hours on 19 April to 0 hours on 21 April. This allowed this rule could have allowed the Ukrainian side, not in word but in deed, to demonstrate its good faith in terms of compliance with ability and willingness to assume to shoulder its obligations and willingness towards peace. Having hastily rejected this initiative, apparently Zelensky, who was under pressure of sponsors and concerns for his image, he quickly changed his view and supported the proposal. The intensity of hostilities along the front line was indeed reduced during this time, but the Russian Defense Ministry has reported 4,900 violations by the Ukrainian armed forces. Specifically, the Ukrainian armed forces continued to carry out artillery strikes and strikes with the use of UAVs, not just targeting our troops, but also targeting civilian objects in adjacent regions of Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk Oblast, and Crimea. The Russian Federation stringently complied with the ceasefire regime and remained at the previously held boundaries and positions. In this way, Zelensky once again eloquently demonstrated his inability to negotiate in good faith, his desire to torpedo any peace processes. He's cognizant of the Kiev regime is cognizant of its imminent defeat and is increasingly slipping into openly terroristic methods. On the 25th of April, Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff was traveling for a new round of negotiations with President Putin. And at that point, the deputy chief of the main operations directorate of the general staff of the Russian armed forces, Yaroslav Moskalik, was murdered. The suspect, Ignat Kuzin, confessed, and he announced that he was recruited by the Ukrainian security services in exchange for monetary remuneration. In September last year, supervisors set out an assignment for him to eliminate Mr. Moskal, and he undertook to carry out that assignment. Yesterday, Ukraine's leadership officially confirmed and acknowledged its complicity in this crime, in this murder. And the secretary of the Rada Committee on Security, Roman Kostenko, commenting on this, announced that such methods will remain within the toolbox of the Ukrainian security services even after the end of the war. And I quote, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, however long is necessary. This further demonstrates the criminal, perfidious nature of the Kiev regime, whose head is purely concerned with saving his own skin and concerned with covering up the crimes that he committed against his own people. And this is why, contrary to the aspirations of the Ukrainian people, he is bent on escalating the conflict and is recklessly rejecting the United States' balanced peace proposals. Nevertheless, the Russian-U.S. dialogue is ongoing. There will be discussions of a number of nuances for the future contours of the peace plan. From the very start of the conflict, we announced that we prefer diplomatic methods for the attainment of the goals of our special military operation. And this is why Russia remains focused on achieving a sustained long-term solution that would eradicate the root causes of the conflict and to prevent the conflict from recurring. As another step towards peace, President Putin announced a truce starting at 0000 hours from the 7th to the 8th of May to 0000 hours from the 10th to the 11th of May. We hope that the Ukrainian side will follow this example. Such a step could be the prelude to direct peace talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine without any preconditions whatsoever. And we are willing to engage in this despite existing difficulties regarding the legitimacy of the head of the Kiev regime. Mr. President, our country's principled approaches towards settling the Ukrainian crisis were voiced by Russian President in June 2024. Let us recall this includes Ukraine's respect for the rights of the Russian language population, the neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of the country, its demilitarization and denazification, recognition of the status of Crimea, Sevastopol, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, Kherson, Zaporozhye Oblast, in accordance with the will expressed by their residents as constituent territories of the Russian Federation. This position is firmly rooted in the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations and is not subject to revision. It is important that those who genuinely wish to arrive at a long-term solution to this crisis provoked by the West, that they take this into account. We expect not empty declarations from them, not calls for truce, which our European colleagues are so vociferously proclaiming just because they understand that Ukraine will suffer a complete resounding defeat. We expect of them concrete, clear signals towards a peaceful resolution. This, first and foremost, applies to an end to weapons deliveries to Ukraine and the willingness to persuade Zelensky of the urgent need to engage in constructive dialogue. And to that end, let us recall there's a need for him, inter alia, to repeal what has been enshrined in legislation at his urging, that is the prohibition against direct negotiations with the leadership of the Russian Federation. And more broadly speaking, to finally honor the pledge made to Ukrainian voters back in 2019 to move towards peace with the Russian Federation, to respect the rights of the Russian language population of that country, and on the whole, to act for the benefit of the Ukrainian people, not for the benefit of those seeking to manipulate Ukraine purely as a pawn in the geopolitical struggle being waged against Russia. When Kiev and its European sponsors recognize this and understand the futility of the very idea of prolonging and pursuing hostilities, when they realize that the alternative to this is a resounding defeat and capitulation of Ukraine, then probably we will begin to move in the right direction. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Mariana Betsa, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Mr. President, I'm grateful to the French presidency and to you, Minister Barrot, for convening this meeting and for your solidarity with Ukraine. We also thank the Undersecretary Di Carlo and the Assistant Secretary General Musaya for their briefings, which clearly outlined the suffering inflicted upon the people of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. I cannot but begin my address to the Security Council by pointing out one of the most recent crimes committed by the Russian Federation. Just today, on April 29th, in Dnipropetrovsk region, Russia murdered a 12-year-old Margarita Titarenko, another child murdered by Russia. Every day, Russia kills our children. Every day, Russia deports our children in grave breach of international law. Every day, Russia tortures our children in the temporary occupied territories. How many children would have been killed by Russia by the end of the war? Daily, the Russian Federation continues to perpetrate acts of terror against the civilian population of Ukraine, systematically targeting critical infrastructure and residential areas across the country. Since 11th March, when the US proposed a full and unconditional ceasefire during negotiations in Saudi Arabia, Russians have used nearly 8,500 guided aerial bombs. Just think about the figure, 8,500 bombs against peaceful civilians in the middle of Europe. The first proposal of the full and unconditional ceasefire has been already for 49 days on the table, but it was rejected by Russia. One of the most blatant attacks occurred on the night of 24th April this year, when the Russian Federation launched a large-scale combined attack on residential areas across multiple regions of Ukraine, using 70 missiles, including ballistic ones, and approximately 150 attack drones. In Kiev alone, the attack took lives of at least 13 civilians, including a brother and a sister, 21-year-old Mikita and 19-year-old Sofia, and also injured around 90 others, among them at least 6 children and a pregnant woman. In this barbaric attack, Russia used a ballistic missile manufactured in North Korea. This is yet another evidence of the criminal nature of the alliance between the Russian Federation and North Korea. This Russian-North Korean bond threatens the security of the entire Indo-Pacific region as well. Recently, Ukrainian intelligence services have documented the involvement of at least 155 citizens of China in the Russian Federation's ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. Evidence indicates that the Russian side is actively engaged in recruiting Chinese nationals through various social media platforms. This cooperation must be stopped immediately. Since the beginning of 2025, at least 577 civilians have been killed and over 2,900 injured, though the true toll is likely to be higher due to limited access to frontline and occupied areas. In April alone, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine verified 848 civilian casualties, a 46% increase from the same period last year. Verification efforts are ongoing, and the number of casualties is expected to increase. Russia's armed aggression has resulted in the widespread devastation of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. According to Ukrainian authorities, over 218,000 civilian sites have been damaged or destroyed. More than 1,600 schools have been damaged, with at least 200 destroyed. Nearly 2,000 medical facilities have also been affected, including 300 reduced to rubble. These figures reflect a sharply deteriorating humanitarian situation and the growing needs of the civilian population on the ground. In this context, the delivery of humanitarian assistance is more urgent and essential as ever. Ukraine deeply appreciates efforts of OCHA and its partners in responding to humanitarian needs on the ground. We're sincerely grateful to all donors and partners for their continued support and solidarity. We call on the international donor community to ensure sustained and predictable funding to enable the uninterrupted delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. Mr. President, Ukraine continues to defend itself against Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal full-scale military invasion of Ukraine in full accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. This is our country. This is our home. These are our families that we are defending. Ukraine did not start this war, and we do not want this war to continue. Russia is the only source, the reason, and the fundamental driving force of this war of aggression. Ukraine has demonstrated more than once its willingness to give diplomacy a chance to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Russia refused to accept a proposal agreed by the United States on 11th March in Jeddah on a full interim ceasefire for 30 days. Russia repeatedly violated the agreements on a ceasefire in the energy sector reached in Riyadh on March 23rd, 25th, manipulating the date of its start, and put forward unacceptable preconditions for the implementation of the ceasefire at the sea. On Easter, Russia made statements about its alleged readiness for a so-called ceasefire for 30 hours. And what do we see? The total number of violations by the Russian army of this so-called ceasefire throughout Easter reached 2,935. On 28 April, Russia proposed 3-day so-called ceasefire starting from 8 May. If Russia is so much willing to stop the war, why don't we start the ceasefire today? Why wait till 8th of May? This proposal, again, has nothing to do with peace. Russia has always used the dates of victory over Nazism for propaganda and disinformation purposes. This year, the Kremlin uses the 80th anniversary, particularly the so-called Victory Parade on May 9th, as a culmination of the victory cult. In reality, Russian soldiers marching through the Red Square on May 9th, 2025, will have nothing to do with the victory over Nazism. Some of them may have massacred civilians in Bucha, Irpin, Izum, Mariupol, and many other Ukrainian cities and villages. No country has the right to claim exclusive rights on the victory in World War II, which was a result of great efforts by many countries and nations. During World War II, Ukraine lost approximately 8 million people. This war had an impact on every Ukrainian family. Each Ukrainian town and villages suffered. That's why our country rejects Russian historical manipulations attempts to downplay or manipulate Ukraine's role in the victory over Nazism. We value human lives, but not the parades. The fire can be seized right now, not just for a parade, and not just for a few days, to continue killing Ukrainians after that, after such parades. Russia cannot be allowed to cherry-pick the politically convenient dates to announce a short-lived ceasefire simply for PR purposes or gain additional tactical advantages. Ukraine is ready to support a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace. And this is what we are constantly proposing for at least 30 days, and we reconfirm this proposal. Mr. President, our position in peace negotiations is clear and consistent. Ukraine wants peace like no one else. However, we cannot accept peace at any cost. We cannot accept peace at any price. Any future arrangements has to respect Ukraine's red lines. First, we will never recognize any temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine as Russian. Crimea, as well as other temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, remain part of Ukraine, according to international law and according to the Constitution of Ukraine. Second, we will not agree to any foreign diktat regarding the structure, number, and other characteristics of the defense forces of Ukraine. Third, we will not accept any restrictions on Ukraine's sovereignty, our domestic and foreign policies, including on the choice of the alliances that we would like to join. A temporary ceasefire, if achieved, should not lead to a frozen conflict. It must be a step forward and a step towards peace on the just and lasting peace. This is a crucial element shaping our vision. The first and most essential step towards any negotiation must be full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. This is the starting point, nothing else. Ukrainian children abducted by Russia must be returned back home. This is a humanitarian issue. Can you imagine the pain of the parents who were separated from their children? Not a single parent should endure this pain. And Russia deported at least 20,000 Ukrainian children in grave breach of international law, trying to erase their identity, giving them different names. And they were so-called adopted by Russian families. These are war crimes. And this is the issue of humanity. Second, prisoners of war. All of them should be returned and exchanged back home. And of course, illegally detained persons, civilians, they should be all of them returned back home to Ukraine. The issue of sovereignty and territorial integrity is crucial and is key. It should be important for all member states, whether we as an international community are ready to abide by the UN Charter and UN principles. Mr. President, the Russian Federation could stop this war of aggression at any time, but they continued not to. Russia wants to continue this war, not to pursue a peace. Russia wants to kill Ukrainians, not to stop hostilities. Russia wants to occupy more Ukrainian territories, not to withdraw from Ukraine, because Russia's goal for these 11 years of genocidal war hasn't changed: to destroy Ukraine as a country, to destroy Ukraine as a nation. Russia doesn't want to see Ukraine as a democratic, free European country. Freedom is virus for Russian society. It threatens the dictatorship in Russia. Aggression should not be rewarded. Aggressor should not be appeased. Any attempt to appease the Russian Federation by compromising fundamental principles would only embolden further violations of international law and set a very dangerous precedent for global security. History has shown that appeasement does not stop the aggressors. It only encourages them. It is imperative that the international community increases pressure on Russia, including sanction pressure, to compel it to cease violations of international law and to pursue a genuine path towards peace. We remain hopeful that the United States, along with other international partners, will intensify efforts to press Russia to accept full and unconditional ceasefire. Unity and support of the whole of the international community is needed to stop this genocidal war. and to prevent its repetition in the future. Peace talks must be based on respect of international law, including the UN Charter. Any sustainable peace must unequivocally respect Ukraine's sovereignty, safeguard our democratic institutions, and ensure the inalienable right of the Ukrainian people to live free from external aggression and to freely choose its future. Sovereignty and territorial integrity are non-negotiable. Justice is not negotiable. Children are not negotiable. We call on the international community, and especially this Council, to reaffirm the truth. Peace without justice is not peace, it's a surrender. And this is what actually Russia wants. They want Ukraine to surrender. They want Ukraine to capitulate. So we have bad news for Russia. Ukraine will not surrender. Again, this is our country. This is our home. And we're defending our land, our people, in accordance with UN Charter. Ukraine is seeking a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the principles of the UN Charter, underpinned by clear and reliable security guarantees on the ground. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency Madam Betsa for her statement, and I to the representative of China.
President, I'd like to thank USG Tikalo and ASG Musuya for their briefings. The crisis in Ukraine drags on to this day, and the fighting continues unabated. The recent multiple attacks have resulted in new civilian casualties and infrastructure damage and destruction. Women, children, and other vulnerable groups bear the brunt. This is heartbreaking. We reiterate our call that civilians and civilian infrastructure should not be targeted under any circumstances. Parties to the conflict should strictly abide by international humanitarian law and make every effort to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Recently, the relevant parties have had a series of engagements and negotiations on the Ukraine issue. China supports all efforts towards peace. The Ukraine crisis involves complex factors. Achieving a ceasefire is by no means easy, and restoring peace cannot be accomplished overnight. The more we reach the critical moment of negotiations, the more we need to exercise patience and wisdom. China has 3 expectations. First, we expect the parties concerned to demonstrate political will, maintain the momentum of the peace talks, and through dialogue and consultation, achieve a ceasefire and restore peace at an early date. Second, we expect all stakeholders to be able to participate in the peace talks, to work together to address the root causes of the crisis, and to reach a peace agreement that is fair, lasting, binding, and acceptable to all parties. As the war is taking place on the European continent, Europe certainly has a role to play for peace. Third, we expect the UN and the international community to create a positive atmosphere and favorable conditions and provide necessary assistance for the peace talks. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is objective, impartial, rational, and pragmatic. We have made consistent efforts to promote peace talks and a political settlement. We have always followed the 4 shoes proposed by President Xi Jinping as our fundamental guideline. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be upheld. The legitimate security concerns of all parties should be taken seriously, and all efforts for peace should be supported. We actively maintain communication and engagement with all parties and work tirelessly for peace and negotiations. China, with Brazil and other countries, have launched the Group of Friends for Peace on the Ukraine crisis to build consensus for peace and advance peace efforts. China stands ready to continue working with the Global South and the international community to play a constructive role in achieving an early political resolution to the crisis. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China.
I thank Her Excellency Madam Zvokel for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Lord Ray Collins of Highbury, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom.
I would also like to thank Under Secretary General Di Carlo and Assistant General Secretary Sawyer for briefing us on the grim situation in Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion over 3 years ago, this Council has met many times to discuss the death, destruction, and misery Russia unleashed on Ukrainians. It has displaced over 3.5 million people within the country, and almost 7 million have sought refuge abroad, leaving over a third of the population in dire need of humanitarian help. And its consequences have been felt far beyond Ukraine too, sending food and energy prices soaring, which has hit the most vulnerable around the world the hardest. We welcome the United States' efforts to end this war, yet it is impossible not to reflect on the sheer scale of the crisis, including the shocking attack on Kryvyi, in which 20 people were killed earlier this month. 9 children lost their lives that day, and the United Nations reported that this was the largest number of children killed in a single strike since the start of the invasion. Civilian casualties have increased by 50% since February, and over 10,000 missiles and drones have been fired into Ukraine since the start of the war. Such brutality has sadly continued from the revolting strike in Sumy on Palm Sunday to the missiles raining upon Kharkiv and Kyiv. We do not see or do not need more evidence to prove that Putin is not serious about peace. Putin's latest announcement for a temporary ceasefire yet again rings hollow. We need only to look to the 30-hour pause in fighting over Easter as an example, during which there was no indication that a ceasefire on the front line was observed. President, I think we can all see through this pretense. Russia must declare a ceasefire now. Not in a day, not in a week. Ukraine stands ready to go the whole way, a durable and full ceasefire right now. So why wait? Why only for 72 hours? If Putin was truly serious, he would agree today to an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire, just as Ukraine has done, not simply to announce a short pause from May the 8th. But Putin chooses not to. Compare that to Ukraine, which agreed to the United States ceasefire proposal over 40 days ago. Make no mistake, United Kingdom's commitment to peace is clear, as is the United Kingdom's commitment to stand by Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Together with our allies and partners, we must continue to work with Ukraine and speak up with one voice in Ukraine's support, because that remains the best way of achieving a just and sustainable end to Putin's selfish war. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Lord Ray Collins for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you for your presence at today's meeting. I also want to thank Under Secretary General Di Carlo and Assistant Secretary General Masuya for the briefings today, and I welcome the participation of Her Excellency, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, in this meeting. Regrettably, Russia's deadly attacks on Ukraine continue unabated. Earlier this month, the attack on Sumy represented the single worst mass casualty attack on Ukraine's civilian population this year. As we've heard from our briefers, attacks continued across the country last week and over the weekend, destroying cities, destroying houses, and killing civilians. On April 24, Russia carried out a large-scale attack on residential areas in Kyiv and surrounding regions, killing at least 12 civilians and enduring 70, including children. These are hardly the actions of a country that seeks peace. The facts speak for themselves. Russia invaded its neighbor in an unprovoked war in breach of international law, which continues to this very day. Ukraine did not encourage this war. Ukraine is not encouraging the continuation of this war. Ukraine is defending itself against an armed attack clearly prohibited under the UN Charter. And while Ukraine has no choice but to continue to fight for its sovereignty and its very existence, Russia has a choice. Russia could end the suffering today. But instead of this de-escalating, Russia is continuing attacks on Ukraine. It is hard to comprehend why one would seek war and destruction instead of peaceful coexistence. Ukraine has time and time again showed its desire for peace by accepting not only the 30-day ceasefire on energy infrastructure, but also a complete 30-day ceasefire without preconditions. Additionally, on Easter Sunday, President Zelensky proposed to abandon any strike with long-range drones and missiles on civilian infrastructure for at least 30 days. We now hear that Russia has suggested a 3-day ceasefire next week. Any pause in the devastating bombings in Ukraine is, of course, welcomed and needed, but there's an urgent need for an immediate and longer ceasefire, a full and unconditional ceasefire, just as Ukraine has agreed to. We now need to see concrete and genuine steps from Russia. Mr. President, Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We stand firmly behind Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. These principles are enshrined in the UN Charter. This is also the position of the majority of UN members. They have collectively and clearly condemned Russia's illegal attempt to change internationally recognized borders by force. This was the case every time the General Assembly has debated this matter, most recently 2 months ago on the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale invasion. Denmark supports any serious and general efforts to achieve a just, comprehensive and lasting peace that respects the principles of the UN Charter and secures Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. Such peace needs to be built on accountability and justice. It should include a robust and credible security guarantees, and this can only be achieved with all relevant actors around the table. This, of course, includes Ukraine, but also Europe. We welcome the progress made at the London meeting between the E3, Ukraine and the United States, and it is important that these processes continue. Mr. President, we need to ensure a just end to this senseless war as soon as possible. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece. I would like to thank the French presidency of the Council for convening this meeting, and I warmly welcome you, Your Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Europe of France, in this chamber. I would also like to thank Under Secretary General De Carlo and Assistant Secretary General Masuya for their very informative briefings.
The Council remained seized multiple times this month in many forms and settings of the repercussions of Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine. Despite recent efforts for peace, led by the United States, the Russian military has continued to strike Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure, killing and injuring civilians, among them children, women and elderly. As the head of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine stated after the recent shelling of Kyiv, these scenes of destruction and suffering reflect a deeply disturbing trend, civilians bearing the brunt of ever more intense and frequent attacks. The effect of warfare, particularly on children, is immeasurable. The war in Ukraine has affected a whole generation of children, either by claiming their lives or by severely impacting their psychosocial well-being. Greece condemns in the strongest terms any attacks against civilians and civilian objects and calls on Russia to immediately cease targeting residential areas and critical infrastructure in Ukraine. International humanitarian law dictates that all parties to conflicts must take every possible measure to spare civilians from harm. Adherence to these principles constitutes not only a legal requirement, but also a moral imperative and should also go in hand with accountability for the perpetrators and justice for the victims. Mr. President, the time for peace has come and it is long overdue. Greece has supported the partial ceasefires with regard to energy infrastructure in the Black Sea. Yet a major step towards peace would be a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire in line with what was agreed by the United States and Ukraine more than a month ago. We regret that Russia did not join the agreement, raising questions about its intentions and showing further mistrust. At the same time, positive developments, though limited and scarce, should be commended. In that respect, we welcome the latest exchange of prisoners on April 19th and hope for the continuation of this practice. Mr. President, Greece reiterates that the overarching goal remains a just, comprehensive and lasting peace achieved through inclusive diplomacy in line with the UN Charter and international law that upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. That was a clear message sent by the international community through multiple General Assembly resolutions, the latest of which in late February. Only Ukraine has the right to decide on its future and on accepting any peace formula. However, sustainable peace requires credible security guarantees to preclude the recurrence of war and ensure that Ukraine remains a sovereign and independent state in charge of its own destiny.
In closing, Your Excellency, steadfast in its commitment to international law and the UN Charter, Greece reaffirms that it is imperative that we all work towards achieving peace and an end to the destruction and suffering in Ukraine. The security of Ukraine has far-reaching repercussions for global security and stability. Therefore, a just and lasting peace needs the active support of us all, of all the international community. I thank you. I thank the representative of Greece, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Undersecretary General DeCarlo and Assistant Secretary Musa, for your briefings. Colleagues, the United States has presented a framework proposal to both Russia and Ukraine we believe could bring about a durable and lasting peace. The path to peace must begin with a comprehensive ceasefire, immediately stopping the destruction and the bloodshed. Regrettably, during the past few months, Russia has continued high-profile strikes on Ukraine, causing needless loss of life, including of innocent civilians. President Trump has called on Russia to cease these attacks and emphasized the need to immediately end the war. Both Russia and the DPRK have openly touted the presence of DPRK troops on the battlefield, a serious escalation and part of a military partnership that violates resolution of this council and enables Russia to continue these strikes. Right now, Russia has a great opportunity to achieve a durable peace. The burden for ending the war rests with Russia and with Ukraine. It is up to the leaders of both these countries to decide whether peace is possible. If both sides are ready to end the war, the United States will fully support their path to a lasting peace. Monsieur le Président, colleagues, the benefits for Ukraine and Russia accepting the U.S. proposal are immense. Their economies can begin to grow, their cities to rebuild, and their peoples to heal. Conversely, the risks that accompany more war are immeasurable. The harm would disproportionately fall on ordinary Ukrainians and Russian families who overwhelmingly desire peace. We urge both Ukraine and Russia to accept peace. We ask our fellow council members and all UN member states to support the path to peace. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the representative of the United States, and I now give
The 9,908th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Hungary, Latvia, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I wish to welcome Madam Mariana Betsa, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Conformément
In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Madam Joyce Msuya, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. Consideration of item 2 of the agenda. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Madam Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today's meeting is taking place at a potential inflection point in the 3-year war in Ukraine. In the past few weeks, we have seen intensified efforts to bring the parties to negotiations. These initiatives offer a glimmer of hope for progress towards a ceasefire and an eventual peaceful settlement. At the same time, we continue to witness relentless attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns. These strikes have killed and injured many civilians and caused widespread destruction in residential areas and civilian infrastructure. Last week, Russian forces launched one of their most devastating assaults to date. On the night of 23-24 April, a massive combined missile and drone attack targeted multiple regions of Ukraine, including Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Poltava, Khmelnytsky, Odessa, Sumy, and Zaporizhia. In Kyiv alone, multiple residential buildings were hit. At least 12 people were reported killed and more than 70 others injured, including several children, making it the deadliest attack on the capital in 9 months. This attack followed other deadly strikes. On Palm Sunday, a missile struck the historic center of Sumy, reportedly killing 35 people. Earlier, a strike on Kryvyi Rih killed 18 people, including 9 children at a playground. This attack stands as the deadliest single strike against children since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. Other cities, including Dnipro, Odessa, and Zaporizhia, have also been subjected to repeated attacks in recent weeks. In frontline areas, civilian casualties are reported daily. Shelling, the use of glide bombs, and first-person view drone attacks in Kherson, Donetsk, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions have resulted in increased civilian casualties. On 23 April, a drone strike on a civilian shuttle bus in Dnipropetrovsk region reportedly killed at least 9 people and dozens more were injured. Most of them were women who worked at a nearby mining and processing plant. Mr. President, as of 24 April, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights had verified 151 civilians killed and 697 injured in the month of April. With verification ongoing, this figure is expected to surpass the March figures, which were already 50% higher than in February. And since February 2022, OHCHR has verified 13,015 civilians, including 699 children killed, and 31,628 more civilians, including 2,016 children, injured in Ukraine. We have also noted recent media reports quoting local Russian authorities that indicate civilian casualties in the Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod regions of the Russian Federation. These include alleged Ukrainian strikes on 23 and 24 April that reportedly killed 3 people in the Belgorod region. We condemn all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, wherever they occur. Directing attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure is prohibited under international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. Mr. President, the Secretary General has called for de-escalation and a durable ceasefire in Ukraine. In this regard, we are encouraged by the diplomatic efforts underway. We take note of yesterday's announcement by the Russian Federation of a 72-hour truce planned for the period from 8 to 10 May. This follows a similar announcement by the Russian Federation on 19 April of a 30-hour Easter truce. After that announcement, Ukrainian authorities reportedly agreed to mirror any such steps, reiterating their earlier support for a 30-day ceasefire proposed by the United States. Regrettably, hostilities continued during Holy Week, with both sides accusing each other of violations. A month earlier, on 19 March, the Secretary General welcomed the separate announcements by the United States, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine regarding a 30-day moratorium on strikes against energy infrastructure and the resumption of negotiations on the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. Despite these commitments, however, attacks against energy infrastructure persisted. Nevertheless, diplomatic efforts continue. The UN remains engaged, particularly on the safety of navigation in the Black Sea, to support global food security and maintain vital supply chains strained by the war. The continued exchange of prisoners of war between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, including the largest to date on 20 April involving 500 prisoners, shows that with political will, diplomacy can yield tangible results even in the most difficult circumstances. Mr. President, as we approach the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, we are reminded with even greater urgency of the centrality of the Charter of the United Nations and international law in safeguarding peace and security. The Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine stands as an egregious challenge to these fundamental principles, jeopardizing stability in Europe and threatening the broader international order. The war in Ukraine is a war of choice. What is needed now is a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire as a critical first step towards ending the violence and creating the conditions for a just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace. A peace that fully respects Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders in accordance with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions. The United Nations remains prepared to support all meaningful efforts towards this end. Thank you.
I thank Madam Di Carlo for her briefing, and I give the floor to Madam Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I welcome the opportunity to brief the Council on Ukraine today, along with Under-Secretary General Di Carlo. Since our last briefings in March and April, the humanitarian situation has worsened despite ceasefire opportunities. As peace talks continue, the human toll of the war is intensifying with relentless attacks, killing and injuring civilians, including children. Civilians are living under constant threat, especially in frontline regions like Kharkiv, Kherson, Dnipro, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and border communities in Sumy. Waves of missile and drone strikes in densely populated areas continue to cause mass civilian casualties and damage or destroy apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, and other critical infrastructure. We are particularly concerned about the use of cluster munitions because of their notorious wide area, indiscriminate, and long-term effects that have led more than 100 states to prohibit them. On 24th April, the Russian Federation launched a large-scale coordinated attack on Kyiv city and at least 8 other regions of Ukraine. According to the UN Human Rights Office, at least 9 civilians were killed in Kyiv and 90 were injured, including 12 children. 44 people were hospitalized. Over this past weekend and even yesterday, hostilities continued along the front lines, resulting in further civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. Donetsk region is most heavily impacted. Mr. President, so far this year, not a single day has passed without civilians being killed or injured in attacks. In the first 3 months of the year, OHCHR verified 2,641 civilian casualties, nearly 900 more than during the same period in 2024, and over 600 more than early 2023. From 1st to 24 April, 848 civilian casualties were verified by OHCHR, marking a 46% increase compared to the same period last year. The verification process is still ongoing, with casualty numbers expected to rise. The operating environment remains highly dangerous for humanitarian workers. From 1st of January to 23rd April, there were 38 verified security incidents impacting humanitarian staff within 20 kilometers of the front line. This has left 3 aid workers dead and 21 injured while delivering life-saving assistance. Mr. President, as this war continues, millions of lives are impacted daily. Essential services are disrupted and humanitarian needs deepened. Attacks on healthcare services and health facilities are crippling access to maternal care. Pregnant women are now giving birth amid blackouts, medicine shortages, and under attack, with a 12% rise in birth complications reported by health workers. For many expectant mothers, basic life-saving care is simply no longer available. Strikes on schools continue to deprive children of safe education. According to OHCHR, 129 education facilities were damaged or destroyed during the first 3 months of the year. Due to ongoing hostilities, at least 600,000 school-aged children are compelled to learn remotely, separated from friends and teachers, and risk falling behind in their studies. Hostilities have driven further displacement. The International Organization for Migration reports that nearly 40,000 people have been uprooted from their homes this year, mainly in the frontline regions of Kherson, Kharkiv, Donetsk, the border areas of Sumy, and elsewhere. In total, nearly 3.7 million people remain internally displaced within Ukraine, and according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, almost 7 million Ukrainian people are registered as refugees, most of them in Europe. Women and children, as in many global crises, continue to bear a disproportionate burden. As the war drags on, the toll on them increases. UN Women reports that sexual and gender-based violence has surged by 36%, while domestic violence has spiked by 20% in just the past year. Nearly 2.5 million women and girls urgently need specialized protection services, yet resources remain dangerously thin. Mr. President, since our last briefing, local media have reported on civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in Bryansk and Kursk regions of the Russian Federation. I must emphasize once again, under international humanitarian law, civilians and civilian objects must be protected. This means that indiscriminate attacks are strictly prohibited. It also means that parties must take all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm, whether they are launching attacks or defending against them. And we lack safe, unimpeded humanitarian access to reach an estimated 1.5 million civilians in need in areas of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia, currently under occupation by the Russian Federation. Once again, international humanitarian law is clear. All parties must allow the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need and ensure that humanitarian workers can move safely and freely. Obstructions that leave the civilian population without the essentials to survive run contrary to this obligation. Mr. President, nearly 13 million people in Ukraine need humanitarian aid, including women, children, older persons, and people with disabilities. With thanks to donors for their support, the UN and partners are doing their utmost to respond. In the first 3 months of 2025 alone, over 340 humanitarian organizations, largely national NGOs, reached an estimated 2.3 million people with life-saving assistance. Aid delivery has been most extensive in frontline areas, providing food, provision of emergency water, essential medicines, and emergency health services. Due to the sharp contraction in humanitarian funding and the subsequent global humanitarian reset, the UN and partners have further reprioritized the Ukraine humanitarian needs and response plan to focus on reaching 4.8 million people with urgent life-saving aid in 2025, requiring $1.75 billion. The objective is to reach those most at risk and most in need, centering on 4 core response priorities: people near the front line, evacuations, emergency response after strikes, and aid to the most vulnerable among the internally displaced people. Without increased support, even prioritized life-saving efforts are at risk. Every contribution matters. Mr. President, I reiterate our earlier calls to this Council for urgent, collective action on Ukraine. First, ensure the protection of civilians, including humanitarian and health workers and critical infrastructure, and ensure that humanitarians have safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to civilians in need wherever they are. Second, scale up financial support. Underfunding is forcing critical programs to scale down, even as the operational environment becomes more complex and dangerous. Additional resources are needed now to save lives and sustain assistance. Third, achieve a just peace. Every effort, whether aimed at a temporary pause or a lasting agreement, must prioritize the protection and needs of civilians. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Madam Msoya for her briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Mesdames, Messieurs les ministres,
Ladies and gentlemen, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, I should have liked not to have had to convene with the European partners at today's meeting of the Security Council on Ukraine. Yes, but the high-intensity war of aggression which is being waged by Russia continues to ravage Ukraine, as was recalled to us by the Undersecretary General and the Assistant Secretary General, with tragic humanitarian consequences in violation of international law and in violation of the very Charter of the United Nations, our Charter. How did we arrive at this point? At its crux was the aspiration of the Ukrainian people towards freedom and democracy, which Russia sought to repress in Maidan in 2014. 10 years ago, a fragile ceasefire was decided upon at Minsk. This was violated 20 times. 3 years ago, the Russian Federation launched its large-scale invasion of Ukraine, a unilateral, brutal, unjustifiable war of aggression which must finally end. A war which was not defensive, which was not inevitable, a war which was not justified and is not justifiable. This was merely the expression of a blatantly revisionistic agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 24th of February last, the Security Council adopted a U.S. resolution, and I wish to quote this resolution. This is Resolution 2774. The Security Council urgently calls for an end to the conflict as soon as possible.
l'Ukraine
What did Ukraine do since the 24th February last? On the 9th of March, Ukraine accepted the principle of a comprehensive ceasefire without conditions in accordance with Resolution 2774, thereby demonstrating its goodwill and sincere desire to head towards peace. And what did Russia do since the 24th of February last and the adoption of Resolution 2774? Russia pursued its war crimes against humanity by striking against infrastructure and by targeting civilians, women, and children, as well as humanitarian workers. And as Russia has been violating the entirety of international law, Russia has been trying to show us that it has been entitled to do so. It was a right to do so, that Ukrainian territory needed to be absorbed into it based on the principle of self-determination. But this is false. It's a smokescreen. What is true is that Russia is violating Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia is waging aggression against its neighbor in this war of aggression. It is violating international law, violating international humanitarian law. Everybody sees this. Everybody is aware of this. And today, the sole obstacle to the ceasefire, now the sole obstacle to the implementation of Resolution 2774, which was adopted by the Security Council on 24 February last, is Vladimir Putin. Why then? Why? Why there in this way object to and oppose the implementation of resolution? Vladimir Putin's Russia is seeking to push Ukraine towards capitulation, to achieve Ukraine's capitulation. France, like a number of other members of the Council, opposes this and will continue to do so. First and foremost, because this is a matter of security of Europe and security of France, which Russia has been striving to destabilize. Because yes, ladies and gentlemen, France is already being targeted. Since the start of the conflict, our country, a supporter of Ukraine, has been targeted by Russian cyber attacks emanating from the GRU, the Russian military intelligence services, based on the APT-28 operating mode. This is they have targeted dozens of French entities, including public services, businesses, athletic organizations linked to the 2024 Paris Olympic and Paralympic Games. We emphatically condemn these cyber attacks. They are unworthy of a permanent member of the Security Council, and they run counter to the framework set out by the United Nations, and they must be brought to an end immediately. But if France, like other members of the Security Council, opposes any form of capitulation of Ukraine, this is not merely due to concerns for security of Europe or the security of France. This is also a matter of peace and security, international peace and security, because such an outcome of the world would entrench and enshrine the might makes right. This would bring the world on the path towards a arms race and proliferation. And so I think we need to revert back to some of the core principles of the Charter of the United Nations, which I wish to recall to refresh everybody's memories. Article 1, Article 2 and 4, it states that all members of the organization shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. That is Article 2, Chapter 1. So let's revert back to a simple principle. These aggressions should not be rewarded at the cost of the aggressed. Borders are inviolable and states are sovereign. So therefore I call upon President Putin, cease fire, cease fire, cease fire. And this is when peace, just and meaningful peace, will become possible, a peace in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, in accordance with international law, a peace that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of Ukraine. And I think that we can achieve this, and this is why we applaud the mediation efforts that have been undertaken by the United States of America at the highest level inter alia. France cherishes the hope that the Council will unanimously demand a comprehensive, immediate, unconditional ceasefire, meaning the silencing of the weapons. Thank you, and I resume my duties as President of the Council, and I give the floor to Her Excellency Madam Barbara Slokelj, Secretary General, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And again, good afternoon to everyone. I would like to thank also to Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Assistant Secretary General Misuya for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, from the onset of this war, Slovenia was pushing for peace. Peace between Ukraine and Russia. Peace in Europe. And not just any kind of peace, but a just and lasting peace firmly anchored in the UN Charter and its principles of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. There can be no winner in wars like this one, and no loser. There are only victims, and we cannot afford international law becoming one. After years of fighting, destruction, and suffering, there is finally an opportunity to make peace. We remain hopeful that the US initiative will produce results. If we want lasting peace in Europe, reaching a full and unconditional ceasefire needs to follow through as soon as possible. Ukraine has agreed to it weeks ago, and I call on Russia to follow suit. Moreover, Slovenia would like to caution against unilateral action with regard to a ceasefire in Ukraine, as it serves little else than removing us further away from a comprehensive end to the war. While Slovenia welcomes any pause in fighting that gives relief to civilians, like the one announced for early May, I underline a very simple fact. There will be no progress without both parties playing their part. There was little clarity about the terms of the moratorium on energy infrastructure strikes or the Easter ceasefire, with numerous claims about violations by both sides. This indicates that we need a verifiable, comprehensive, and lasting ceasefire that will pave the way to negotiations on enduring peace in Ukraine. Mr. President, ceasefire might be the necessary first step towards peace, but in itself, it's not enough. We are witnessing a surge in civilian casualties. Russian missiles and drones have been hitting residential areas, causing death and destruction in Kryvyi Rih, Sumy, Kyiv, and other Ukrainian cities. While we push for peace in this chamber, throughout Ukraine, civilians are being buried under rubble. schools are being leveled to the ground, and physical integrity of nuclear facilities is being threatened. While we discuss drone attacks, grave violations of international law remain unpunished, and Ukrainian children remain displaced and deported. If we want peace to last, all perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity must be held accountable. On a related note, Slovenia hopes that peace negotiations...
Give the floor now to the representative of Romania.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I would like to express my gratitude for allowing my delegation to take the floor. A month ago, Mr. President, in this chamber, my delegation expressed disappointment that efforts for dialogue undertaken during March in Riyadh had not borne the results we all wanted: a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter. Currently, continuous efforts by the United States, Ukraine and European countries towards peace are not met with a similar level of engagement by Russia. On the contrary, genuine efforts for peace are met with more killing of Ukrainian civilians and destruction of civilian infrastructure. Some of the more recent attacks against civilians are among the most horrendous. And this deadly trend is also confirmed by the briefers today, to whom I would like to thank for their important briefing. We also believe that there can be no impunity for such acts. The path to peace needs to provide dignity to all victims of the war, as well as accountability. Mr. President, 2025 is a crucial year and a test for our resolve as UN member states in defending the principles of the UN Charter. And this year can become the year of peace in Ukraine. As a country neighboring Ukraine, in the immediate vicinity of an unjust war that has ravaged an entire country and many generations of innocent people, there is no alternative to our unconditional support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. It is essential for Russia to seize the window of opportunity and engage meaningfully in negotiations. Romania supports any steps that ensure the respect of the principles of the UN Charter and pave the way without preconditions towards a ceasefire and safe navigation in the Black Sea. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Romania for his statement, and I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, I speak on behalf of the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia. I thank the Presidency of the Council for convening this meeting, and I thank the Undersecretary General De Carlo and ASG Msuya for their comprehensive briefings. As concluded by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, in the first 3 months of this year, twice as many civilians were killed in Ukraine compared to the same period last year. Deliberate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute a war crime. And the Baltic states condemn all heinous acts and call on the aggressor to stop these attacks. And while diplomatic efforts to find a solution to end the war are ongoing, Russia's attacks on civilians continue to increase. It is more than clear that Russia is not interested in peace. Russia rejected the permanent ceasefire proposed by the United States. The so-called temporary truce that Russia has recently announced is nothing else but a poor attempt to deceive the world in its desire for peace. Russia's crimes serve as a stark reminder that impunity gives way to repeated crimes. Ensuring accountability is essential to ending impunity and preventing further atrocity crimes. And in this context, we're glad to note that the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine is in its final stages, and perpetrators must be held accountable. Mr. President, the Baltic states welcome all efforts to bring just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in Ukraine. A peace that is rooted in the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Just and lasting peace in Ukraine is fundamental for the long-term credibility of the multilateral system. The potential peace deal must fully respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The return of abducted children, prisoners of war, and civilian internees shall be part of it. And steps must be taken to ensure full access by ICRC to all protected groups in accordance with the international humanitarian law. We continue to call on all states that stand for the UN Charter and international law to support restoring justice for Ukraine. Mr. President, the Baltic states firmly stand by Ukraine, and our support is unwavering and unconditional. To conclude, I would like to remind that so-called root causes of the war that Russia brings to the table are Russia's attempt to restore its sphere of influence and change the international order. It wants to decide on the future and choices of sovereign nations, not only in its neighborhood, but in other continents as well. So let me underline, international system defined by imperial and colonial ambitions is not the world we want to live in. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Latvia for the statement. Distinguished colleagues, there are still a number of speakers remaining on the list for this meeting. I intend, we are almost out of time, but I do apologize.